something in moving through the world as a Jewish person that can be similar. I mean, we both get like a lot of anti-Semitic hate on Twitter.
Right, okay, so that's an experience, right? Our experience of anti-Semitic hate. But that does not suggest that we have a common interest except against the anti-Semitic hate. Okay, when you suggest that
yeah, you just said it out loud. So people who are in, let's say, a marginalized group, like trans people or like Black Americans, for example, they would probably want to have something that protects them in legislation against a biases that's occurring to them in real life. All right, this just dropped. Apparently Ben Shapiro debated Ezra Klein.
referenced it a bunch of times and not actually got into the content. So
why we're polarized.
Why we're
you
polarized.
You can buy it wherever you buy your books.
100%. Go get it. It's actually a really interesting read. Obviously, as somebody who reads a lot of...
If you don't know who Ezra Klein is, I think he's the editor-at-large still of Vox, and, you know, there are some good things he takes, but he's extremely libby. So, I mean, you'll also see videos by him where he's just praising Hillary Clinton and how she demolished Donald Trump in the debates and how she's absolutely going to destroy him in the upcoming election and how, you know, it's basically what you get. But I would say he's obviously much better than Ben Shapiro in this case.
Books on the other side of the aisle. I found this to be a particularly informed take with regard to especially the social science research on tribalism and how people group and how people find identity. I want to start with one of your premises, and it's a premise that I actually think it certainly divides the two of us and our perspective on American politics and the world. You talk about identity politics, and you defend identity politics. You have a pretty staunch
defense.
defense.
Redefine identity politics.
Right, and this is why this is sort of the question. So I want to read you the quote on it because I don't want to take it out of context or anything. So you say, unfortunately, the term identity politics has been weaponized. It is most often used by speakers to describe politics as practiced by members of marginalized groups. If you're black and you're worried about police brutality, that's identity politics. If you're a rural gun owner decrying universal background checks as tyranny, or a billionaire CEO complaining that high tax rates demonize success, or a Christian insisting on nativity scenes in public squares, well, that's just good old-fashioned politics. With a quick sleight of hand, identity becomes something that only marginalized groups have. So here's my question. I read this, and my first reaction was, this seems like a category error to group all these things together. The reason being that in one case, you are talking about race, an immutable characteristic of human beings that is not innately linked to politics.
Maybe I am.
And in other cases, you are talking about actual ideological groups which are innately linked to politics. I mean, how you identify as a Christian is certainly going to have ramifications based on your interpretation of Scripture for politics. How you identify as a gun owner obviously is going to, that is an activity. It is not you were born a gun owner. It is you chose to be a gun owner, possibly based on your feelings about guns. Like for me, my advocacy for the Second Amendment began before I owned a gun. Right? For a lot of people who are in favor of lower tax rates, they're not millionaires, they're not billionaires. 63 million Americans voted for President Trump. The vast majority of them are not millionaires or billionaires.
Well, a lot of them wanted higher tax rates on rich people.
Well, that's true.
Including at sometimes Donald Trump.
I mean, that's true, but it is also true that for the senators who are being voted for and for Congress people who are being voted for, people have voted for lower taxes in the past. I voted for lower taxes when I was not making as much money. I vote for lower taxes now that I am making a lot more money. So the question that I have when it comes to identity politics is the kind of identity, if you are going to kind of lump all of this together, I do have an objection, which is, I think it is fair to object to identity-based politics on the basis of a mutable characteristic because there is no necessary conjunction between skin color and politics, whereas there is a fairly necessary conjunction between your religious outlook or your political outlook and identifying with other people who have that political or values-based outlook. We tend to...
That's an outrageous statement. Holy shit. I mean, I guess I'm going to see what the pushback's going to be, but that's just in and of its surface, like the way that the political system itself is going to impact you if you happen to be part of a marginalized community, specifically, especially if there are laws being passed that disproportionately target people of color, that absolutely is politics. It's like, I don't understand how you would suddenly remove that.
Associate with people who share our values, but if we in life only associate with people of our same race, we tend to get very uncomfortable with that, and I think that's perfectly appropriate.
How do you define just identity? Take politics out of it for a minute. What is identity?
I mean, in my view, I mean, identity on a broad level is obviously all the things that make you you. So presumably, race would be a part of that, of course. But in terms of what is appropriate to bring into the political square, what is it appropriate to polarize politics around? I know I'm jumping past your question.
So the argument you make, because I want to make sure I'm following it, is that race is immutable, and as such, it poses, and you can tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, it poses a particular danger to politics in a way that something like religion, something like an ideological perspective, something like where I'm from, I'm a Californian, that doesn't. That the sense of identity is chosen or built on at least shakier ground, inherited, are different than identities that are somehow something you can't take off.
Like, I wonder.
Yes.
Why?
I wonder if he would say that about things like Jim Crow laws, right? Like, would you be like, well, I mean, I don't think that this is actually involving immutable characteristics such as race with the political apparatus. I mean, I think these are just necessary for everyone to have a better experience in their lives. I mean, you know, shorter lines for drinking fountains, because there are now two. It's not exactly a no-brainer there.
Because if the conversations that we have about politics are designed to shape each other, if we're actually, the conversations that you want to have and that I want to have, the conversations about convincing each other, if those are to have any effect in the real world, they cannot be based on immutable characteristics, because those characteristics are immutable. But
hold on, they're not based on immutable characteristics. I mean, when people talk about one sec.
Sorry.
When people talk about identity politics in coming from race or coming from really anything, the idea is not that the politics itself is an immutable characteristic. But the argument being made, at least in part, is that something about the way you're moving through the world, whether it's because you're African American or Hispanic or Jewish or Californian or you live in a rural area, is alerting you to some experience or giving you some experience that then, at least in theory, is speaking to a broader truth. I know that sometimes when you argue this point, you like to make a cut between a politics based on experience and a politics based on data. I think of experience as a way of pointing you towards what is true about the world. You then have to validate it, but nevertheless you can. Bring that in, the idea that you would take that out, that something that was immutable in you, that you couldn't take off, is something you can't have in politics. That seems wild to me. I mean, of course it's something you need to be able to have in your politics. If you're having a distinct experience.
That's an incredibly nice way. I've always wondered, by the way, why Ben Shapiro films these sequences so close together. Like, every time we watch the Ben Shapiro special show, it's always like they've got to be like able to breathe each other's breath, you know? So right beside him. But yeah, obviously showing a lot of patience and being like, what the fuck are you talking about? Because that kind of would have been my response. Here's an example. The Bill C-16 in Canada, the one that Jordan Peterson was really big mad about because he thought, I might have to say Z and Zer, I can't pronounce those words, I don't know what they mean, you know, kind of shit. Prior to gender identity being included in the provisions of protected classes in Canada, you would be allowed to fire someone simply because they were trans. You would be allowed to evict someone or not give them housing simply because they're trans. Now you cannot do that, right? They become protected. So you could say that identity politics is playing a role in something that may be immutable, but ultimately, yeah, that was something that had to be achieved through the conventions of the political system.
Because of your race or because of your sexuality or whatever it might be, to say you're going to wall politics off from that, not only does that seem weird to me in terms of what politics is for, but isn't how politics ever worked.
No, but the point that I would make is that you are now conflating experience with an immutable characteristic. And that is an argument that I object to on the left.
But
and I think that it is innately directed.
I don't understand what you're saying.
So so the argument that I'm making is if you and I share an experience, right, and that experience.
This is an experience.
Okay, but that's not an experience. That's a characteristic. If
but
you and
there's something in moving through the world as a Jewish person that can be similar. I mean, we both get like a lot of anti-Semitic hate on Twitter.
Right. Okay. So that's an experience, right? Our experience of anti-Semitic hate. But that does not suggest that we have a common interest, except against the anti-Semitic hate. Okay, when you suggest that
yeah, you just said it out loud. So people who are in, let's say, a marginalized group, like trans people or like Black Americans, for example, they would probably want to have something that protects them in legislation against a biases that's occurring to them in real life.
There is such a thing as a Black interest, or as a I don't want to use Jewish because Jewish actually has religious overtones, obviously. Judaism is both an ethnicity and a religion. And you and I disagree, I'm sure, very widely on the ramifications of what it means to be Jewish even. So Jewish identity is a little fuzzy because it actually branches off into a couple different areas. But race is...
But all identities are fuzzy in that way.
Race is
not in that exact way. But all identities have big groupings within them. And you're doing a crude cut, right? Whenever you're talking about demographics, you're modeling the world in a crude way that is going to get things missed and wrong at the individual level.
If the problem throughout American history, and I think it largely has been, is white identitarianism, then why is that a problem, but Black identitarianism or Hispanic identitarianism is not?
I think that the problem is when the policy is bad.
But you don't actually believe that. And
I do believe that.
The reason I say that you don't believe that is...
I mean, that explains so much, that last concept.
Because the same policy applied to one group becomes good, and a policy that is applied to another group becomes bad.
The problem is when the policy is bad. If we have a policy that it works better when applied in one direction or another, as you, I guess, occasionally do, although we should talk about examples because I'm not really sure what you're referring to there. You can...
Affirmative action, for example.
I think affirmative action is a way of righting a historical injustice is a pretty straightforward policy. It seems to work, and you're dealing with something that has actually happened in American history. To say that you're dealing with a very straightforward effort there to pay down a debt.
Well,
And by the way, I'm not saying that Ben Shapiro is a white supremacist, but a white supremacist talking point often in the opposite direction of affirmative action, and the more alt-right, let's just say toned down version of this argument comes in the form of, why should we have quotas? Why should we have anything like that when at the end of the day, shouldn't we be consistently looking for the most qualified individual? And if the most qualified individual in any given instance happens to be black, then so be it. You hire the black person because they're the most qualified when it comes to that. With that leaves so much out of the picture. Like it's such a more complex topic than that. If you want to talk about all the way from the ground on up in terms of like, what exactly is your housing situation? What exactly is your family situation? What exactly is your community situation? What exactly is your schooling situation? That's going to usually be based on those other factors. Based on that, are you able to have a lot of resources and access and the time to be able to achieve scholastic achievements in your life, right? That goes forward into, are you going to be able to then apply for university? If you're able to apply for university or college or whatever it is, are you going to be able to afford it? If you are not able to afford it, are you going to be able to secure the loans necessary to be able to afford it? If you get that far, then you graduate, and even then you're still saddled with all that debt. Are you then going to be able to get a job that you need to be able to pay that down? And if you look at everything I just said out loud, is it going to disproportionately be harder for a black person to do that in America than a white person on average? Yes. The answer would be yes. So there's a lot of things along the way. So just saying, well, I mean, we should just look at it from the perspective of the most qualified person should get the job. And that's all there is to it. So again, if it's a qualified black doctor, then he should get that over a qualified white doctor. And that's how I'm just being, hey, I don't see race, okay? I don't see it. It does not exist. I'm completely colorblind, and this is how the whole world should work.
The argument in favor of affirmative action is now being based on the experiences of people presumably under segregation or Jim Crow, and we are now in the year 2010. Okay, first of all, the efficacy of affirmative action is very much in doubt, according to the research of the Thornstroms, but putting that aside.
I disagree with you, the efficacy is in doubt, but we don't have to go through a peer review here. But let me ask you this question just straightforwardly.
Sure.
Why is it that if you are the head of a household, African-American household, and you have a job, full-time job, you're going to have a lower net wealth on average than the head of a white household who is unemployed? Or similarly, if you're the head of an African-American household, you have a college degree, you're likely to have a lower net worth than a white household headed by somebody who dropped out of high school. That is speaking to something that has happened historically, right? Wealth
no question.
Wealth is an intergenerational transfer.
Of course.
At some point, if you want society to be even roughly equal, you're going to have to do something about that intergenerational injustice.
Or alternatively, the idea of equality would be that everyone is treated equally under law, not differentially by race or based on past discrimination.
That is one idea of equality.
Well, this is correct. And this is why, when you say why we're polarized, and the implication is that we are polarized because of tribal identity, the real reason I think that we're polarized is because there are two very different visions of the world and how the government ought to operate in that world, meaning that you're positing a sort of Rawlsian view of justice. I fundamentally disagree with the Rawlsian view of justice. I do not think that society or government is in a place to achieve equality of outcome, nor do I think that the attempt to, in Thomas Sowell's phrase, to achieve cosmic justice is something that is either possible or desirable from the government.
When you say we can't achieve, I can totally buy the argument that you don't want it to, or that you think it would be unfair. But I think there's a very big difference that it's important to keep in mind between cannot and should not.
Well, I mean, you're right. We could achieve equality of outcome. It would involve the oppression of hundreds of millions of
But not even equality of outcome. You can achieve low levels of reparations for past injustice through things like affirmative action. I mean, we can disagree about whether or not affirmative action works, but positing that it could, just doing a little bit to try to do things about what has happened in the past.
Yeah, one person's equality of outcome is another person's equality of opportunity as well, right? In reverse. One person's equality of opportunity is another person's equality of outcome. You want to try, like, there's no such thing as, and no person who's a socialist or a communist will ever say that they want there to be, like, perfect, unbelievable equality amongst every single person, because there are going to be factors that are out of your control, such as I will never be able to play in the NBA, something like that. There's going to be factors out of your control in terms of what you are able to achieve. But should everyone have, as much as we can work towards it, a similar equality of opportunity? Because that's something worth striding for. You won't have ever the same equality of outcome. That's just a weird thing to ask for, right? There are going to be human beings who are smarter than me, and there are going to be human beings who are faster than me. There are going to be human beings who are funnier than me. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff. But should everyone have an equal opportunity? That is more towards something that I think is worth working towards.
not going all the way towards totalitarianism.
Well,
let me actually back us up for a minute, because I think we should talk about identity and polarization, because I think something in my definition of polarization is getting missed here.
All right, go for it.
So 2 things. So 1, I agree that polarization is dramatically about ideology and dramatically about very different ways of looking at the world. The argument of the book is that what is different right now is that those are sorting so neatly by party. So go back to the 1960s, let's say. Civil Rights Act, right? There's part of the country that is against that, part of the country that is for it. That's clearly a very big difference in belief about how the country should be governed, what we should do, and what is right for the government to do, right? I mean, to take that as more than just a racist argument, there's also a set of arguments about, what is the proper role of the federal government, what are states' rights, et cetera. What is remarkable about that moment in American politics is it does not split by party. In the House and the Senate, you have a higher proportion of congressional Republicans vote for the Civil Rights Act than Democrats. And then a Democratic president, of course, pushed and signed it. So you have a truly bipartisan effort on civil rights, and also a truly bipartisan opposition to it. So it isn't that we have, in my view, deeper ideological differences today than we did then. I think the ideological difference over is segregation by law a okay or even commendable thing to have is a much more dramatic ideological difference in most of what we're dealing with today. The difference is that a lot more of our distinctions drop across party lines, not just ideological, but identity as well. And it is the merging of those ideological, identity, experiential, demographic, and then the cutting of them by our politics that is really different here. So polarization, we've always been disagreeing, and we've had much more dangerous moments of societal fracture than this one. What is distinct about this moment is the degree to which they layer onto party, and then how that interacts catalytically with our American political institutions. So I don't in any way wipe away the idea that there's a great ideological debate to have here. Just that we're not in a new era of great ideological debates. What we're in a new era of is party polarization.
So, I mean, I agree with an enormous amount of that, and that I think is the most solid part of the book. I think that what I disagree with is that the prescription is that identity politics generally should be treated the same based on the group that is claiming identity.
That was interesting. It's not very spicy, but I think Ezra kind of approached it from a kind of calm, I'm not going to flip out live in the middle of the show, and rather just try to accomplish something.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback, because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we are prepared to embark on a mighty jihad in your name. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your humble jester, attempting in vain to get you to laugh. To our valiant knights of the Round Table, Benji Arnie, Tech Tink, Scary Earth Human, Tony, DM Rivera, Resident Scarecrow, Sir Nickus, Mayred, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Brandon, Words Greenwood. It doesn't matter what I believe, it only matters what I can prove. Egbert Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Coulter Smith, Jenna Tao, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevbot, EXE, Brian Ephraim, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojack, Saren 42, Catherine, Ramon Acosta, Incosin, Agent NDN, Violent Orchard, Political Puppy, La Media Panza, Zach Christensen, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our mugs and salute our brave heroes off to another glorious conquest.